Jason, if you want to start us, that would be awesome.
Yeah, hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. As you guys know, this is what is it, Saeed? Maybe a monthly that we're doing these, the
Yes.
meetups, mainly to discuss things around Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Autopilot, Intune, RBAC, scope tags, filters, all the joys that come with managing machines, and obviously a disconnected environment that we now live in with COVID. So my name is Jason Adams. I come to you guys obviously on a nice, maybe cold Saturday where I'm located here in the US, but hopefully it's a little bit warmer for you guys. I want to give an introduction, obviously, to our two speakers today. We have Thijs, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the last name. Maybe is it Lecomte?
Yeah, something like that. That's okay.
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, my Flemish isn't very good, and my French is even worse, so I can't do that too well, butcher it. But he comes to us obviously as a senior Microsoft 365 consultant, also as an MVP around Intune automation and security. He's coming to us today from Belgium, and then we have Arnab Mitra, who's a senior PM in the fast track world where I operate as well. Arnab's going to obviously talk to us around Autopilot, and Thijs is going to talk to us around RBAC. So I don't know who wants to go first. Arnab is obviously coming to us from Texas. Let me mention that as well. But I'll kick it off to our speakers today.
All right, awesome. I think I'll get sharing starts right away, if that's okay.
Yes.
So we're going to be talking about RBAC within Microsoft Endpoint Manager today. Really excited for this. I have the chat open to my left, so feel free if there's any questions or remarks to have them during the talk. I'll see if it makes sense to answer them, but otherwise we also have some time after this session to go through the Q&A. So a very well introduction was already given. So my name is Thijs. I'm a Microsoft 365 consultant working for The Collective Consulting, which is a Microsoft partner in Belgium, mainly focused on endpoint management, security, and the automation of the two. I am an MVP in enterprise mobility in Intune, and I'm also an author for the Microsoft 365 Security for the IT Pro book, which is actually an ebook around the whole stack of Microsoft 365 security that a couple of us MVPs are developing with monthly updates. So if you want to know what's going on within the Microsoft stack, all of the naming changes which are announced, this ignites. This is the book to watch. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to be seeing RBAC within Microsoft Endpoint Manager. We're going to be talking why we need RBAC. Also some best practices. I have been implementing a lot of RBAC throughout my different customers. Lots of demand for that. And I see Jason also had lots of questions. So it's indeed a big topic at the moment. We're going to be talking about custom roles, how you can limit the role of a user, and also scope tag, how to limit the scope that an admin has permissions to. And I also have some few real world examples where I'm going to be diving into some projects I have done recently, showing how I have set up them for each company, just to show you some examples of what I'm seeing within the real world. So maybe a small introduction, of course, Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I think it's pretty well known for everybody here, but Microsoft Endpoint Manager is a combination of different products. It consists of both Intune, so that's what all we know and love. It's cloud management, but we also have a config manager through Tenant Attach, which means we can push policies to on-prem domain joined PCs. The main focus of this talk is going to be about Intune, but we'll briefly also touch on Tenant Attach. So first, maybe some best practices about RBAC in general, about roles in general. Because I think it's important to start off with this. It's independent of Endpoint Manager, what should you be doing with your domain accounts, with your admin accounts? So first of all, they should be cloud-only accounts and should not be synced from on-premises. Why is that? It's just to decrease the attack surface. If the on-prem would be breached, it's much easier to also breach cloud accounts, cloud admin accounts if they're synced. So admin accounts should not be synced and should be cloud-only accounts. Also, it's important to have a separate account. There shouldn't be any permissions on your user account. Should never be the case, even with PIM. you should always be focusing on separate accounts. Why is that? Well, you can have stricter policies, for example, conditional access policies that say an admin account can log in from certain places, while a user account might have less restrictive settings. And also just because the admin account will not have a license, they will not have a mailbox attached. So the chance that the admin account is phished if you have separate accounts is much less. And of course, I touched about it before, PIM is privileged identity management. That's actually a part of Azure AD Premium 2, which means you don't have an active assignment of role. You don't have it. You don't always have the role, but you have to activate it. So that means an eligible assignment. The activation can be automatically or can be done with approval or through like requiring MFA. So PIM is an extremely powerful product to use, and it can also integrate with the custom roles with Intune that I'm going to be talking about today. So maybe let's first start off with why do we actually need RBAC within Intune? Because maybe people are thinking, well, I have Intune admin. What else do I need? I have given this session before, and I got an awesome remark that time is a company doesn't need custom RBAC up until there is an accidental wipe. So somebody accidentally wipes the device of the CEO, for example. Up on that point, they might not have a need, but if that happens, they will need it. So that's why we have the different roles. You should try to limit the scope of an admin as much as possible. Even if the admin is allowed to do everything and is the Intune admin, try to limit it. If he doesn't need to wipe a device, don't give him the ability to wipe the device. It's to protect yourself as the maybe security admin, but also to protect him from himself. We are all human. We can make mistakes. We can accidentally click on the wipe button really easily. But yeah, if you don't have the possibility to wipe, it's much better. And then of course we have also different entities, different locations. I have lots of companies which are in one big tenant, but there are multiple sub companies in between. They're called, for example, I have one company with operating companies, so opcos, and each they're in a central tenant, but they each have their own IT and they want to manage their own IT, their own devices. But it should be limited. So the scope should be limited to only their own devices. And that's what we can do with granular RBAC, as we can say team A can only manage the devices of their own, and then team B can also manage their own devices, but they cannot manage each other's devices. And also maybe different teams. Some customers might have an Intune admin, which is responsible for both Windows and mobile devices, but the bigger companies I work with have a separate team for the mobile devices, iOS and Androids, and the desktop devices, so Windows and Mac, and they don't want those teams to intervene with each other as well. So these are a couple of use cases that you can say why you want to limit the RBAC for a company. But of course, there might be lots of different reasons out there, but it's important to think about if you need that granularity. I think most people might not think they would need it, but it's really better to try to protect yourself. So how is RBAC done within Intune? Well, we have the built-in roles in Azure AD, which is Intune admin, but that's based on Azure AD. It's something that's on top. What we can also do if we have those custom RBAC roles. So we can create RBAC roles, which means we can limit the scope of the admin, and then we can say he can delete a device, he can sync a device, but he cannot wipe a device, for example. So with custom RBAC roles, we can really limit what a IT admin is allowed to do, which actions is he allowed to take. That's limiting what is he able to do. We can also limit to which policies or to which devices he can have access to. So that's through scope tags. So with scope tags, we can really manage the scope of a Intune admin. And this means, for example, team A can only manage the devices of team A, team B can only manage the devices of team B. So that's how with scope tags, we can limit the scope of those administrators to make sure that they do not manage each other's devices. So briefly touch about it before. Within Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we have, of course, Intune Administrator, which is allowed to do everything within Intune. And of course, we also have the Global Administrator, which also has permissions on everything that is Intune related. And we also have the ability to have some custom roles. So Microsoft provides some custom roles with a limited scope that we can use and implement. And these are defined by Microsoft, for example, a reader or a help desk admin. But we can also create fully custom RBAC roles. This is really awesome. Fortunately, not all of Microsoft products supports them. For example, in SCCM, of course, we had that all the time. But in the cloud, it's less prevalent. And Intune does support it. So custom roles, we can really specify what kind of permissions a administrator can have. So that's really to limit what a admin can do. We can also limit the scope. So what we can do is we can attach a role, so a RBAC role within Intune. We can attach that to a scope tag. A scope tag is something we can attach to a device, an application, a policy. Is it a configuration policy? Is it a device compliance policy? We can assign it to everything. So that's how also roles and scope tags are connected, as we have that custom role. We assign that custom role to a specific scope tag, and then that scope tag is assigned to devices and policies. And of course, we can have multiple roles, and we can also have multiple assignments for the same role. So we could create a local Intune admin, and then, for example, create a scope tag for the US and a scope tag for Belgium, and have those separately for the different Intune administrators. Now, it's important when we have those scope tags as how we're going to assign it. Well, it's important if you're using custom RBAC, if you are using policies, it's mostly a manual process. This means you can go into the console, and if you create a new policy, you should manually tag that policy with the correct scope tag. So if you are the IT admin, for example, for Belgium, you will have the ability to create all of the policies that you to scope all of the policies you create with the scope tag of Belgium. And that's how you assign your scope to these policies. So you can assign them yourself if you're just creating it, or the generic IT admin can assign them to existing policies. But of course, if you're using policies, it's much easier to do that manual process, because normally you won't have 1,000 different policies. But of course, you're going to have lots of devices. So if you have lots of devices, it's not just, you can do it manually, but it can be a hassle. And unfortunately, we have some alternatives to automate the assignment of a scope tag for a device. So there are a couple of different things we can do. As first, we can use a assigned group. So this means you create a Azure AD group, and you manually add devices into that Azure AD group. And then you assign the scope tag to that Azure AD group, which means if a device is added into that group, he automatically receives the scope tag, for example, the scope tag of Belgium, and then the Belgian Intune admin will have automatically the permission to manage that device from Belgium. But of course, you don't want to manually do that addition to a group. Of course, we can do dynamic groups. So in Azure AD, we have the ability to create dynamic groups, which means we can base it on the autopilot tag. We can base it on the name of the device, on the operating system of a device. So for example, if you have the need to tag Windows devices with the tag Windows and an Android device with the tag Android, it's really easy to create a dynamic group based on the operating system, and then again, assign that scope tag to the dynamic group. Of course, what is really unfortunate is that dynamic groups are limited. Within Azure AD, there's not lots of possibilities. Within SCCM, we have tons of abilities to create collections, dynamic collections, but that's not the case for Azure AD. For example, I had the question from a customer recently, which was, I want to assign a specific scope tag based on the user, the primary user of that device. Now, that's not something we can do with Azure AD dynamic groups, because there's no filter or no rule to check the user of a device. So what we, of course, can do is we can create custom scripts. We can use PowerShell, we can use the Graph API, but through automation, we can really create smart groups. And that's where I mostly end up on, is creating smart groups through a script. So what I do for some customers is I have a script running that runs each day. In the evening, we'll retrieve all of the devices within Intune, and then we'll check the logged in user, the primary user. And for that primary user, we will check the country and Azure AD where he's based on. And based on that country attribute of that user, we will assign him to the correct group. So it really depends on what your use cases are. If you can solve lots of devices, you can use an assigned group. If there's more devices and the membership rules are basic, you can use a dynamic group. But if you're facing limitations with the current filter possibilities for dynamic groups, you can always create custom scripts. It's really easy to do it through the Graph API. It takes some getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's really handy to create advanced filters within Intune. So I see also a remark from Keith, which is nice, as you can write a device extension attribute and manage the extension attribute within AD and then sync that to Azure. That's indeed the case. So you have lots of possibilities to do, for example, with extension attributes, but of course, to fill in the extension attributes, you would have to also have a manual action or do that automated through a script. And if you're doing that already, it might make more sense to do that manipulation directly in the cloud, in my opinion. But maybe the use cases from Keith vary. But I try to do as much as possible in the cloud and don't try to have a big impact on an on-prem AD, also because most of our customers are currently moving into a Azure AD join-only scenario. But so to conclude, policies mostly done manually. Tag assignment for devices we can do automatically through a group, schedule scripts, and automation. There's lots of possibilities here. It varies on what your exact use case is. Now, we have the custom role, which will limit what a department can, what an admin can do, and we have the scope tag, which limits which devices he can manage. But imagine if a Intune admin wants to create a policy and he wants to assign that policy to only his devices. Well, Intune doesn't know Azure AD groups, and it's impossible for Intune to, for example, if you have created a policy and assign that to a specific group, Intune cannot check all of the individual scope tags of those devices. That's not something Intune will do. So there needs to be a way where we can limit to what groups, both users and device groups, a admin can assign. And that's something we can do with assignment groups. So through assignment groups is what we say within the configuration of a custom role, we can limit to which groups a user can assign. And so we will say within that configuration of the custom role, we will say, okay, admin A can assign policies to these 5 groups. And if he tries to assign a policy to another group, it will not work. So that's how we limit what the assignment scope of a custom role is. Now, I think it's the right time to dive into the portal and also show you how this is done to really get an idea of how everything works. So let me dive into the portal right here, and I might have to enlarge this a little bit. So let's start at the homepage of the Intune admin. So if we go, of course, to endpoint of Microsoft.com, this is the Intune admin portal we all know and love. And RBAC is configured within Tenant Administration. So within Tenant Administration, we can go to Roles. And here within Roles, we can do all of the configuration for RBAC within Intune. So the first goal is always to create a scope tag. So a scope tag is defined here, and a scope tag, creating a scope tag doesn't have any impact, so you can create whatever you want. It's really easy to create a new scope tag. Let's just try this. We do test scope tag. Just a name, we give it a name, and then we have to assign it. So this is to assign that scope tag to devices. So we select certain security groups, and each device in the security group will receive that specific scope tag. And that's what I talked about just now, is how do you want to populate those groups? Do you want to do it manually, dynamic group, or custom scripts? So that's something you have to think about, is what is my complexity for assigning the scope tag to a specific group? We don't have to fill in an assignment here. We can also just skip this, and then no device will automatically receive the scope tag. So we click on next, and then we click on create. And now the scope tag is defined. So what we actually can do is we can go to devices overview. Let's go to all devices. Then here we can see every device within this test environment. I can click on any device available here. I can go to properties, and I can, here we see scope tags. I can open the scope tag, and I can assign one or more different scope tags. So let's say here I want to assign the test scope tag. I just click it. I can remove the default one. I click select, and it's important to just click save here. So now this device will be manually assigned the scope tag. The same can, of course, be done for configuration policies and applications. So we can go to configuration profiles, select a random profile. If you go to properties, we can also see the scope tag assigned here as a default one. We can, again, select scope tags, select or just the newly created scope tag, and click save. So this is the process of just assigning those scope tag. Of course, this is something you would want to automate, but this is something that's done manually. It's really important to know that not everything within Endpoint Manager supports scope tag. For example, autopilot devices. So if you go to the autopilot database through enroll devices and then Windows autopilot devices, I don't have a lot here, but there's no way to assign a scope tag here. So this means there's no RBAC possible within the autopilot database default. So if you want to do RBAC on the autopilot database, you would have to create a custom application, a custom portal on top of the Intune portal. What else is things like iOS volume purchasing apps. I don't know if I have any here. Let me check. So VPP apps. VPP apps do not have the ability to have a scope tag assigned. So here you can see it says it has the scope tag default, but we cannot edit this. So iOS volume purchase program applications do not support scope tags. There's not lots of policies that do not support scope tags, but there are. So you have to be aware of these limitations. And it's important to know of this before you begin your journey of custom RBAC within Intune. Let's hope the Intune team tries to limit this feature, because these are really deal breakers for some customers, but it's important that you should be aware of these kind of issues. Now that is scope tags, of course, we can go back to roles. And here we see all of the different roles. So there are a few built-in roles, as you can see, which are provided by Microsoft and is a nice way to start. But I think it's easier to just create your own custom role. Name this test custom role and click next. And here we can configure every permission that there is. And so you can see there's lots of possibilities here, and we can go really, really granular. So for example, we can click on, let's choose device configurations, and we can say, can somebody create a device configuration? Can they read it? Can they assign it? Can they edit it? Can they delete it? So you can have a really granular possibility here. And that's not only possible for device configurations, but also for filters, also for the managed Google Play. So here you can really define what an IT admin can do. So this is something you also have to check upon your own use cases, is what limitations do you require? For example, you have the remote help app, which is pretty new, which will do the remote control through Intune. It's also to configure it here. It's important to note that new possibilities will appear here. So if Microsoft comes up with new functionality within Intune, like the remote help app, This is something that will be on every existing role, will be set to no. And if you want your IT admins to use it, you need to manually enable it. This can be a good or a bad thing, of course. I think it's a good thing that you as the generic Intune admin can have the granularity to enable certain features only when you have tested and validated them. But of course, there's lots of possibilities here. So you have to check every configuration out there to check if it makes sense to enable. And after you're happy with this configuration, you can go ahead and save it. I just want to go a little bit further into the wipe, for example. What you can do is you can create a pseudo Intune admin custom role and select every possibility out there, but only set wipe to no. And this means they can do everything instead of wiping. And you could say wiping is a different role, is behind PIM, is behind approval, just to make sure that an admin doesn't accidentally wipe a device. So once you're happy with the configuration, we go to next, and then we can have a scope tag assigned to the role as well. Now, this can be really confusing, but it's important to know that this is the scope tag to manage the permissions of this role. So you shouldn't assign a scope tag, for example, of department A. Otherwise, department A might have the ability to change his own permissions. So it's important here that you select, for example, the default scope tag, because this means only the Intune admin will be able to configure it as custom role. So we click next and we click create, and then that custom role is assigned, is created. Then we can go back to this role, so we can see what we have configured, and then we can assign it. You can have one or multiple assignments, and a user can also be assigned multiple roles. So they will add up to each other, or if they're based on different scope tags, they will work together. I'll come back into this in a little bit with a setup I have done for a client. So for by default, this role won't do anything. So what we have to do is we need to create an assignment. So let's say this is department B or department A, whatever. So we give it the name. This is the name for the assignment. And then we say, which are the admins for this role? So who should be assigned this role? Here we can also select a Azure AD group. So I just select a random one. So this is who are the admins that receive this role. Then we have these scope groups. So this is the assignments groups that are possible. So if you select all devices here, the admin will be able to push policies to every device out there. If you want to limit this, you need to have one or multiple groups added to this. And this will mean, for example, if I select these two, the IT admin will only be able to assign policies to those two Azure AD groups. Handy tip, those can also be nested groups. So what I do in my configurations is if I have one group, which is called Department A assignment groups, and then in Azure AD, I just nest all of the groups the admin has to assign to, which is much more convenient than going into this role assignment each time. So these are the assignment groups, and then the scope tag is to link the scope of the admin. So let's just select the test scope tag. So if we have done this, we have within the admin groups set who are the admins of this role, scope groups to which groups can the admin assign, and scope tags, which is the scope, for example, which devices can he wipe or manage. Of course, really bad example here because I have selected the same for admin groups and scope groups, but it's just an example. We'll go into some more use cases in a bit. So just general roll through of how you can do it in the portal and what it's all about. Demo, and now I'll dive into some examples I have seen with my customers and which implementations I have done. Give me a moment to turn on the light because it might be really dark for you. This should be a little bit better. So let's begin with a sample setup. Setup example number one, which was a customer of mine who has different sub-companies. So they have one big company, which is the owner. Let's call it the owner of the company, which has his own IT department. And then each sub-company also has their own IT department. What was the use case here is that each sub-company should be able to fully manage their own devices. If they want to wipe a device, they want to wipe a device. If they want to push a certain policy to a device, they should be able to push a certain policy to a device. With one limitation is that the owner wanted to configure a security baseline. And this means that there are a generic policy, a global policy, which was assigned to every device within the organization. So every device in the organization should receive this policy, and the sub-companies should have read access to this security baseline, but should not be able to configure it. So this was the setup. And what we also had is they wanted two Intune admins. They wanted a full admin, which is just a custom role with everything set to yes, but also a basic admin, let's call it the help desk admin, which has read permissions and the ability to wipe a device. So what we have here is we have two groups, two Azure AD groups, and we have a custom role, which is the reader role. So this will be only to have read access, and he will be assigned to the global scope tag. And this global scope tag will be assigned to both the security and the productivity baseline. So every sub-company has two Azure AD groups, full admins and basic admins, and they're all assigned the same role. So they have one role, reader, which is read access to all of the policies with the global scope tag, what the owner decides as the baseline. But of course, then we also have two different roles. So we have the full admin and the basic admin. So the full admin was able to do everything they want. The basic admin is limited as the help desk admin. These custom roles are assigned to the department-specific scope tags, and that's where they're able to manage their own devices, create their own custom policies, but they cannot edit the security baseline. And that's also an answer to a question that was in chat. Can a user have multiple roles assigned? This is a great example of how you can have a reader role for specific permissions, but also a full admin role for other policies he wants to create. So I'll also dive into the portal because I have an example created for this. So how is this set up? Well, of course, we need to have different scope tags. So we have to have a global scope tag for the global security baseline, which every device needs to have, and then a scope tag per administrator. Besides those, a scope tag per department, apologies. Besides those, we have the roles. And for the roles, what we have is we have these roles. We have a reader role. And if you look into this only has read access to a couple of things. And if we assign this, it will be the read of global policies. And what this means is this is assigned to the admins from department A and B, and he will be assigned the global scope tag. So this means the admins from A and B, department A and B, will have read access to all of the policies with the global scope tag. What else is we have a custom role, another one, which is the department admin. And this has lots more configurations. He can do a lot more, lots of more permissions, but there's two assignments here, one for each department. And so if we check, this is assigned to department A. The name is department A. It's assigned to the department A admins. They can only assign to the assignment group. So that's an Azure AD group with lots of subgroups. And this is assigned to the scope tag, department A. How will this look like in practice? Well, I'm logged in as a global admin. I have every permission out there. If I look into the devices, I will see there's lots of devices available. And if I go into policies, I will have lots of policies configured. If I navigate to department A, so this is department A admin. If I go into devices, Then I go to all devices. I have a limited view of only 2 devices. If we check those 2 devices, these will have the department A scope tag assigned. The same goes for configuration profiles. We have a different possibility. So we have the department A policy. This is assigned the scope tag department A, and I, as an IT admin, can configure everything here. I can check whatever policies I want, and I can push it out to my assignment group. But I also have the global policy, which is assigned the global scope tag. And here I have read access, but I cannot edit this policy. I cannot update it. It will not let me save it. So this is a big difference where for the department A policy, I can manage it. For the global policy, I cannot manage it. And of course, I, as department A admin, can only see either policies with the global scope tag or with my own department scope tag. But if we navigate, let me check, to department B, the department B admin will have visibility, hopefully, on a department B policy, and he will never be able to see the department A policy. So this is a great way if you have a multinational with different teams managing it, you can really restrict what they can do, but still have those global policies that you want to be assigned to everybody, but they can always read it. And that's what's really important for me and for my customer, is that even if it's a department and they cannot edit the global policy, they should always be able to view the global policy and see what the assignment status is. If there is a failure of that policy, they know that it might be an error on the device, might be something that they need to look out for. So that's one setup I have done. Example 2 was for another customer, was a little bit the same, where they also had different locations, but here they wanted to define a scope between department A Windows devices and department B and department A mobile devices. So each department had their own mobile or Windows admin, which is a layer on top, of course. How do we do this? Well, of course, we will have 2 roles. We will have the Windows admin and we will have the mobile admin. And here we will have not one policy per one scope tag per department, but multiple scope tags per department. So we can have a department A Windows scope tag and a department B Windows scope tag. So this is to limit to which devices the Windows admins can manage. We also have the mobile admin, which will then be assigned the department B mobile scope tag, just to limit that he can only manage mobile devices. These are just some examples. Of course, your organization will not be the same. It will be different, but it just goes to show you that it can be a little bit complex, but you can have multiple admin roles, multiple scope tags, and intertwine them so you can have the scope tag configuration that you need. I think it's a really powerful feature from Intune. Not a lot of organizations use it, more should. But it's a really nice way to limit the scope. I talked about PIM before, and the annoying thing is if we go into the PIM configuration and Azure AD, we will not see our built-in or custom Intune roles. We will not see them within the PIM configuration because it's not an Azure AD role. It is a Intune custom role, and these are not known to PIM. So a fellow MVP created a nice example of how you can integrate PIM with Intune roles, and this is through privileged access groups. So what is a privileged access groups? Is you can also assign an eligible assignment to this. And this means you will not request access to a role, but you will request access to be a member of a specific group. And this means if we request access to that specific group, we will be in the group which has the Intune custom role assigned. So this means instead of just using a Intune admin and configuring a eligible assignment here, we'll have a Azure AD privileged access group that the user can PIM to, and then he is a member of that group. Thanks for linking it in the chat, Jason. So really nice example. If you want to learn more about it, check the blog in the chat. But this goes to show you, while there's no native integration between PIM and Intune, it can be possible to bring them together. And it's something I really recommend that you implement. Well, this all sounds great. Few limitations, in my opinion. As first is BitLocker keys. So you would think BitLocker, that's a part of Intune. Well, it's not. And BitLocker key is saved to the Azure AD object. So this means if an admin has only access through a Intune custom role, he will not be able to see the BitLocker keys. For that, you have to assign the help desk admin Azure AD role, which is a hassle. Microsoft is working on something, they say. They talked about it on Twitter, but there's no solution for this. So by default, a user with a custom Intune role will not have any BitLocker keys. Also, group management. By default, an Intune admin has the ability to create security groups. If you create a Intune custom role, he does not have the ability to manage Azure AD groups. So he cannot create his own Azure AD groups. So if the Intune admin and an Intune custom role needs to create groups, for example, dynamic device groups for all his iOS devices, he needs to do that through a different role. Assignment groups, while the idea of assignment groups is really nice, it's important that, of course, you should not allow a admin, department admin, to alter his assignment groups. Because if you can, for example, if he has the assignment groups for department A, but he is able to add a group for department B, then he can also assign policies to department B. So you need to limit the scope of who can update those assignment groups. Last but not least, I talked about it before, autopilot devices. Autopilot devices don't support a scope tag, so there's no RBAC within the autopilot database. So either they have access to all of the autopilot devices or they don't have access. So if you want to delegate it, again, you need to create a custom solution, a custom portal on top of the existing Intune portal. A few important notes is that if you assign a custom role to a global or an Intune admin, it will not have any effect because a global and Intune admin have access to all of the scope tags. So global and Intune admins is something you want to avoid. Second is by default, if you go, we can see this here in tenant administration roles and then administrator license. An admin needs to have an Intune license. If you want to avoid this, you should go to the administrator licensing and check to make sure that a Intune admin doesn't need to have a license. Besides that, in the monitoring, we also have the My Permissions bit. And here we can see what permissions the role has. Of course, I'm an Intune admin, so I have every permission out there. But if we navigate to a custom role to our department A admin, we can go to tenant administration, roles, and we can see my permissions. And here we can see what permissions this user has. Unfortunately, this is not perfect because we cannot see the scope of those permissions. So for example, this department A admin has only read access to the global policies, but there's no distinction here between which scope tag is assigned. So while it's a great thing to check, it's not that useful if you have multiple scope tags assigned to the same user. And nearing the end of my session, a quick touch on Tenant Attach. So Tenant Attach is where you can manage the devices of SCCM, of MEM-CM, I'm sorry, through the Intune portal. There's a couple of distinctions here. Is that there are a few remote tasks to there is the possibility in an Intune custom role to have a few interactions with config manager devices. So this has the ability, for example, to initiate a sync on a device, not an Intune sync, but an SCCM sync. That's something you have to enable on a custom role. And it's also important if you want a admin to manage SCCM devices from the Intune portal, that needs to be a synced user. That goes against every principle I have, but if you're using Tenant Attach, you need to use synced administrators because SCCM also needs to recognize the RBAC, so it needs to be a synced user. So if you're dealing with Tenant Attach devices, you have to sync your admins, unfortunately. So getting to the end of my session with only 5 minutes overtime, let's do a quick recap. Custom roles are really awesome, and I really recommend them for every organization. Even if you're the sole Intune admin, just create a role, for example, that doesn't allow a wipe, and put the wipe against a PIM approval that you can only wipe a device when it's absolutely necessary, and you don't accidentally wipe a device. Remember that you can create multiple scope tags, multiple Intune roles, and you combine them. So advanced scenarios like I talked about are possible within Intune. It just takes a little bit time to get into. Number 3, everything we do for custom roles within Endpoint Manager is focused on Intune. But of course, there is a really big connection between Azure AD and Intune. So if you create custom roles within Intune, know that they do not have the ability to create groups, Azure AD groups, and they do not have the ability to read BitLocker keys. Really 2 big downsides. So let's hope the Azure AD team and the Intune team bring them together so we can have an easier time. And last but not least, of course, PIM integration. It's a great article from Jan Kittil, really recommend it. And every custom implementation of Intune should also try to use PIM to make sure that there is an approval behind every request to become the Intune role. Coming up to the end of my session, I had an eye on the chat during the call, and I don't think I didn't answer a question except the last one from Keith. He said, so targeting group writeback will not work on MEM devices, MEM roles. I'm not sure if I understand the question, Keith. I don't know if you can come off mute if you want to, or elaborate on chat.
Yes, I know that for config manager, you'd have to have the user on-premise, etc. But, I have been, I'm still developing our security because I am broad spectrum within the organization. So, I don't get to focus much time in that area. But, one thing I have been thinking about is, because we're starting to slowly move more to the cloud and Intune and Azure, etc. But one thing that crossed my mind was, because we do have group writeback enabled, Microsoft depreciated the user writeback, a few years ago. But with a config manager, can you target certain admin roles to one of those groups that are written back from Azure to on-premise? Have you tried that?
I haven't tried that, so I'm just talking in theory, but as long as they're synced accounts, so synced user accounts, that shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if there's any else questions, you can put them in chat or come off mute.
Yeah, I'll come off mute. That's very, very informative. I did see that it looks like the ConfigMan team is trying to fix one of the RBAC issues. It looks like they rolled it out in 2106 technical preview as far as fixing the role-based access. So I'll throw that link in the chat. So hopefully that'll make its way into a version of ConfigMan, and that'll hopefully make some of the RBAC permission a little bit easier when you do the cloud attach or tenant attach.
Yeah, it's you can see they're still developing, unfortunately. It's not all perfect, the RBAC within Intune, because if I'm not mistaken, even I think that a settings catalog in Intune is still not supported for custom roles. And these are real limitations we have to deal with, unfortunately. But thank you for linking the article. I'll have a read of it because I hadn't seen it before.
But that makes me think of the initial, PIM, its limitations right now that I mentioned at the first of your session. If they would develop that, that would essentially eliminate some of these RBAC role, issues that we're having if they would add that functionality into PIM, and you just PIM up a custom role that you create yourself with all these roles already enforced. So, you know, you might have rights in different role, custom PIM roles, and one role might be able to wipe a device, but you might not need that role. You can do a lesser role whenever you PIM up, and you know, you can say, okay, let's expire that, or it's only good for an hour, etc.
Yeah, and that's something I really recommend to look into. It's possible now, but limited. So you'd have to create your own PIM groups and then PIM to mobile manager or Windows manager or wipe admin, stuff like that. So that's something I recommend, but it's sometimes tricky to implement in an organization because, let's be honest, who is not going to PIM each time to global admin? So it takes some getting used to. But let's hope in the future, I think the ideal scenario is that we would have Azure AD custom roles, where we can also limit the scope within Intune. And that's something I really look forward to, as we have administrative units right now in Azure AD, which is only limited to users and groups. So limiting, for example, if you have a group admin and assign it to a specific admin unit, he can only manage groups for that admin unit. Let's hope they bring in device support as well, because that would mean RBAC throughout Azure AD and Intune could be integrated into one. Yeah, and I see David John, his remark is, it's really important to get security in as fast as possible because people have a hard time to change up, to limit their thinking. It's unfortunate, but I see it a lot.
Yeah, just to elaborate on David John's thing is, you know, we moved a couple of years ago over to Cloud Attach, et cetera, and I started slowly moving things up. And I actually run into that problem is, you know, quick and dirty, when you have so many things, you say, okay, these people who are in Config Manager that might have restrictive roles, you say, okay, I'll just give them Intune admin because there is nothing else in PIM. Then when you go in and you set up something like, you know, the Google store or something like that, and someone goes in and changes it all, then you're like, you have to stop, back up, and change all these RBAC permissions. So yeah, it's painful when you have to go back and revisit that, you know. So yeah, David, that's set it up proper. Spend the time to set it up proper out the gate.
Yeah, I think unfortunately there's no IT admin with too much time on their hands. If there's any, love to meet them because I have some work for them. But everything has to be done quick and dirty. And unfortunately, security takes a hit there. But we're going to be continuing to see that, unfortunately.
Definitely a wonderful session. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now. This way the session will stop here, unless anyone have another question before we stop. Okay, stopping the recording.